Hello lads and ladies, today we will rank every kit on a tier list from F to S. Before that, let's make sure to smack that subscribe button. Let's get into it. Starting off, we have the F tier. This tier is for kits that are awful and almost never useful. At the very bottom we have Jack. Jack's oil blobs are easily avoidable, damage teammates, and are expensive for their lack of use. Next up we have Santa. Santa's strafes do cost less than 3 TNT, but the TNT is very predictable and can be countered by ceramic or obsidian. Also, they have a long delay after you throw the strafe. Next up, we have Merchant Marco. Merchant Marco is one of the worst economy kits, as economy kits usually help their teammates, but Merchant Marco can't use his kit unless he buys stuff. Randomness on his refunds means he's unreliable and mostly no kit. Next up is Cogsworth. His robots are expensive, unreliable, and sometimes stop working. Enemy teams can easily destroy them and get free loot. Even charging them makes little differences. Next up is Dino Tamer Dom. His dinos are about as effective as TNT, which is really weak, and the dinos have a long cooldown, and they cannot even be dropped to teammates. Next up we have Drill. Drill is similar to Cogsworth, except his drill does decent damage, but enemies can respawn as many times as they need to in order to take out the drill. Resources can be taken by enemies and drills are expensive. Next up is Warden. Warden is bad because his buffs only apply when an enemy is locked up, and enemy respawn time hardly matters late game or when you can just block in. Next up is Catherine. She can use her projectiles to hit their walls, but gloops already do that and more. Weak damage and a huge nerf at the time her projectiles stay on the ground makes her horrible now. Next up is Miner. It takes too long to mine a petrified player and the loot isn't that good. Enough said. Next up is Raven. Ravens do 4 damage and are decent to scout an area, but Raven being immobile while using them makes him easily susceptible to attacks. Not to mention they can't kill an enemy. Next up is Cyber. Cyber's drones can be controlled effectively, but any arrow and the loot is no longer yours. Spawning TNT is okay I guess, unless you get sniped. Next up is Yeti. Yeti can get in, roar, and get out. Not very effective for the blocking in meta. It can help a bit or when you can't block in for some reason, but is rarely useful. Not to mention the 60-second cooldown. Next up is Alchemist. He has to cycle to get his ingredients, which people can just kill him, and on top of that, most of his pots are ineffective and inefficient. Many kits can do what he does and do it better, but not hurt themselves or help an enemy. Rounding off F tier, we have Bounty Hunter. His bounty selection for some reason targets the same players over and over without a way to switch them, and he has no help in defeating his bounties, as in PvP advantage. His loot is also bad, most notably early game. Now we move from the F tier to the D tier. D tier kits aren't as bad as the F tier kits, but aren't competitive. At the very bottom we have Zurot. Flying is very slow and doesn't help much, and his void breath is worse than a sword as it is much slower. Next up is Vanessa. It takes too long to charge up the triple shot on a crossbow and headhunter to be useful. All other bow kits are better. Next up is Axolotl Amy. In short, her axolotls suck. They aren't effective and you have to be close to your teammates to support them. Next up is Frosty. Early game he is decent, but mid and late game his snowballs have no impact on enemies. Slowing enemies does nothing against movement kits and telepearls. Next up we have Croco Wolf. This is no kit but a buff on Bedrake. Over time his buffs run out. Having no other abilities puts him down. Next up is Vulcan. His turrets are ineffective against telepearls and don't stop people blocking in. They do okay damage but are a bit expensive. Next up is Gompy. Gompy's downside is that he can only have one projectile charge, and it's better in knockback than it is damage. Most of the time, damage is better than knockback, especially in Gonti's case where he only has one projectile. Just use a bow. Next up is Talia. Her chicken egg farm can be destroyed really easily, and quickly with kits like Yuzi or with fireballs and TNT. Her chicken eggs can be destroyed too easily to be effective. Next up is Farmer Cletus. Similar to Talia, his crops can be easily destroyed, but he generally gains resources more quicker than Talia, and is not luck-based. On top of that, he has Jacko Booms for offense. Next up is Ares. He can only hold up to 8 spears, he can hit himself, and by the time you're able to afford them, bows are just a better option. At least they give static. Oh wait, arrows can do that with an enchant. Next up is Zenith. He can be a bit effective, except that he becomes a huge target. You don't want to give a reason to be targeted by a team. Next up is Lumen. Lumen's projectiles do poor damage and aren't as useful as a bow. No Emerald Sword also makes him even worse. Next up is Grim. He only heals about 1/4 of his HP, which can be useful, but ultimately has no role in a ranked strategy. Next up we have Warrior. Warrior doesn't do anything too useful, and Warrior armor isn't much better than Diamond. Even if it is, it doesn't change anything when everyone gets Emerald armor. He basically becomes no kid. Next up we have Whim. Whim's debuffs make him horrible early game, and other range kits can do more damage and more consistent damage. His fire rate is slow, and by the time you get all the elements, he will have access to enchants, bows, and telepearls. Finishing off D tier, we have Melody. She's a decent healer, but cannot defend or heal herself. Now we move from the D tier to the C tier. C tier kits can be competitive, but are usually a replacement or in a specific setup. The best way to put it is they are underwhelming. At the very bottom, we have Freya. She can be decent early game with stacks, but not being able to find Emerald Sword and having slightly slower hit speed put her down. Next up is Trapper. His traps don't do that much for defending the bed, but can be useful. However, since the enemy knows you're Trapper, they'll take precaution. Add on top that traps can be expensive. Next up is Smoke. His footsteps give him away when he's invisible. Its smoke blocks make PvP wonky, but he isn't horrible. There's a kit later on though that heavily outflashes him. Next up is Yamini. Climbing walls is nice, but a 10-second cooldown puts Yamini below many other movement kits. Next up is Yumeko. His chakrams do more damage than a Frostbow, but are very situational. His invisibility is good, but can be revealed when you're holding an item. Fitting into 1-block gaps is cool, but it forces you into a specific running animation when you're playing him. A very mixed bag indeed. Next up is Fortuna. Her cars can be useful, but you have to have the right combination and be aggressive. She just isn't in her prime anymore. Next up is Nyx. Nyx adds some damage to attacks, but not enough to be game-changing. Next up is Hephaestus. He's horrible early game, but really good late game. His problem is that he dies usually before he gets any good. Next up is Star Collector Stella. Her stars only give 20 to 30 extra health before they start to cap off, and if you want critical chance, it is much more efficient to get the enchant, but she has her uses like helping a jug early game. Next up is Lassie. The only good thing about her is that she applies sticky. If she didn't, she would be horrible. She's good at dealing with runners, but not jugs. Next up is Conqueror. His banners are pretty good, but can be broken by enemies. On the bright side, it's usually too chaotic to break them mid-fight. Fire can be used to help ranged kits, and healing can help in any fight. Anti-knockback has its uses as well. Next up is Builder. Builder is good early game, but her defenses crumble mid and late game. No PvP advantage is also bad. Next up is Agni. Her jetpack is useful, but can be disabled by sticky and zaps, and her cluster bombs aren't the most helpful. Next up is Beekeeper Beatrix. She can get a decent amount of resources, just isn't as good as some other economy kits. She also has a problem with cycling. Next up is Ignis. Extra shield is useful for bed breaking, and she's decent at breaking beds mid-game if the bed has little to no defense, but is very situational. Next up is Elder Tree. You can get a lot of HP, but it's extremely unlikely. You also have massive hitbox, and it makes you a massive target. Next up is Evelyn. Her teleport ability is useful, but lacks purpose and a coordinated strategy. Rounding off C tier is Baker. Baker's health apples are bad, but the speed pie is great to support a teammate, and the golden apple is expensive but useful. Baker is an expensive kit to work with. Now we move from C tier to the B tier. B tier kits are competitive options but aren't the best options. Starting us off is Leon. Leon can do massive damage with the triple swords, but they have a long cooldown to get all three back. The single target attack is near useless. Just use a bow mid PvP instead. Next up is Styx. Styx portal duration got cut in half, and her teleport speed is nerfed, but can be useful in transporting the whole squad to a location. She just needs to get the last kill on almost every enemy to keep up the portals. Next up is Archer. Archer can do a lot of damage to one target, but in squads, it's all about having to take down a team. Archer is pretty good, but can't deal with groups of enemies as well as other kits. Next up is Electra. She isn't horrible now, but she isn't good. 8 seconds for 2 dashes is okay, and the dashes apply static for a bit. Other movement kits unfortunately outclass her. Next up is Terra. Terra has a lot of versatility, but blocks can be very hard to land and have a long cooldown. The block's defense is pretty good, but they can be bowed down. Next up is Flora. Flora is a tricky kit to use, and her beehive grenades do pretty good damage. Her flaw is that her mobility is tied to an item, which you can only carry 5 of. Next up is Ember. He's really good at dealing with groups, but lifesteal has been removed from the main enchant rotation, only being in Chaos. His main flaw is being unable to buy an Emerald Sword, but his Infernal Saber isn't as bad as the Light Sword. Next up's Kalaya. Her punch is useful in PvP and can help even the odds in a fight. However, she cannot get stronger, which makes her a poor jug. Next up is Hannah. Hannah's 90 HP can be solved with Forest, and is really good as a heal support for kits that need them. She is also good in team fights as she can eliminate weak foes and combo executes. She's only good in team setups though. Next up is Lucia. You can use this to get good gear fast if you play aggressively, and with a bed defender, enemies breaking your pinata becomes less an issue, but it isn't unlikely. Next up is Vexat. Being able to run and bow is a great ability. Similar to Archer, he's great for taking out one enemy and can keep them from regenning. Overall, a solid option. Next up is Umbra. He did get a buff that gives him 15 shield when teleporting to an enemy, which helped place them higher. His main use is teleporting to a cycler to get them when they least expect it and steal their loot. Next up is Pyro. Pyro used to be great, but the Ember cooldown is what made him drop in the rankings. He is great at dealing with teams, just slow to get to his max potential, but overall he's still pretty good. Next up is Trinity. As a great support at tier 4, 5 shield per hit can go a long way. Void Angel isn't that useful however, and you can get stuck on a tier if you get spawn killed. Next up is Crypt. His skeleton army takes time to build, but when he unleashes them there's no stopping them, unless there's a kit that's good at dealing with forts like Ember. Next up is Sheep Herder. 45% extra damage on all sources is pretty good, and she only loses 2 sheep on death. And 1 sheep gets highlighted after a minute. Her issue's finding the sheep, but when she has them, she's pretty good. Next up is Cobalt. Cobalt is a great all-around tank kit for all stages of the game. On top of that, you get extra speed at 3 batters, which is quite useful, not a horrible jug. Next up is Yuzi. Yuzi is a great mobility kit as you can get 4 times the quick succession if needed. Her cooldown is not as bad as other kits. Her main weakness is more expensive swords. Next up is Infernal Shielder. He has 10% damage reduction, which is great, and on top of it, he can leap away to get away or ambush foes. and reflect all projectiles. Not crazy overpowered, but still pretty good. Next up is Gingerbread Man. His gumdrops give a lot of shield per bounce and are not too expensive. Great for PvP. Rounding off B tier is Sigrid. Sigrid is good for early game bed breaks, and the charge is useful and is overall a very fast kit with no cooldown issues. Now we move from the B tier to the A tier. The A tier hits are highly competitive options that many people play. Starting off is Noelle. She got nerfed quite a bit but always had an advantage recovering for 2 rolls while supporting the 2 she is it. Even when they fall, she can support herself quite effectively. Next up is Milo. Milo is one of the best solo Q options, as he's an insane bed breaker and great for stalling during block decay for 2nd place, and he gets 25 shield and speed on reveal. Overall a great bed breaker and kit in general. Next up is Barbarian. Barbarian is really good when jugged and supported. Barbarian doesn't have to wait 10 minutes to get an Emerald Sword, he can get a Rage Blade in 7 or less. As long as he's supported, he's really good. Next up is Void Regent. He's really good at moving around unpredictably and can heal quite a bit when he strikes enemies. One of the better movement kits. Next up is Xeno. His ability always being able to inflict static is very useful, and is always a great range kit except early game. He also has the advantage of being able to hit an enemy behind a wall and not needing to buy ammo. On top of that, he is very low skill. Next up is Caitlyn. She's a good jug and kill support and can get stronger the longer the game goes on. She also does decay damage, which you can stack on top of fire. Next up is Zephyr. He's great early and mid game but sucks late game, so Zephyrs don't make a late game. Zephyr is a kit that's easy to squad wipe and you can get there fast. Next up is Sheila. Like Noelle, nerfed a lot but is still decent. She can shred through enemy health or rapidly heal herself. It may take a long time to get there, but it's usually worth it. Next up is Jade. Jade is Void Regent with a 1 second shorter cooldown and can make enemies take up to 40 fall damage, which penetrates armor. Great for movement and PvP. Next up is Atatunde. Like Barbarian, he can get Emerald Sword levels of damage without Era, but while he does less damage than Bard, he can instantly destroy or hollow and bed defense. If he doesn't want to do that, he can give himself shield or damage enemies around him. Next up is Elric. Elric starts off really weak but can get very strong and has no limit unlike Barbarian and Atatunde. On top of that, he can support teammates that need his help. Next up is Fisherman. He gives insane loot for just sitting around, golden fish or not. He can also replace a Cycler and be a bed defender, as well as support the Jug with loot. Also, he can get Coral, which is stronger than Obsidian, and get an RPG, which I don't even need to explain how OP that is. Next up is Whisper. Whisper can help any teammate early game and mid game. On top of that, she can save enemies from the void and keep enemies under pressure. If you get Plunder from Chaos or Fortune, you can accumulate a lot of loot. What is there not to like? Next up is Lanny. Lanny can teleport to her teammates and heal them, and that doesn't even cost emeralds. There is a limit of 1 scepter, however. Next up is Nyoka. Nyoka is a great healer, support, and can be a great runner or cycler if he needs to be. Low falling is a very broken ability, and he has his overcharge and can apply knockback if he needs to. And he heals himself, unlike other healers. Rounding off A tier, we have Metal Detector. Ever since his buff, he's a lot better now and can get a lot of loot fast, especially with Electra's favor. Cycling has never been more rewarding. Finally, we move from the A tier to the S tier. S tier kits are the most overpowered kits and the most competitive kits. Starting off, we have Lila. Lila is good in all stages of the game, and she is great with dealing with crowds using her flowers. On top of that, her Floral Headhunter does a lot of damage. She's the best ranged Jug. Next up, we have Marina. Marina did get a few nerfs, but her insane damage is here to stay. She's the best defender and can stop people blocking in. Next up, we have Marina. Marina did get a few nerfs, but her insane damage is here to stay. She's the best defender and can stop people blocking in. It makes people have to stop and destroy your jellyfish or get zapped instantly. In third place is Triton. Triton can basically teleport across large distances. He's great for early game bed breaks and bed breaks in general, and can stun enemies to get the first hit advantage. Overall, he's a great movement kit. In second place is Pirate Davy. Davy can quickly travel across the map with one cannon, and can easily fly in for a bed break. On top of that, any TNT he launches is doubled, and TNT is cheaper. Much better than a Santa Strafe. In first place is Airy. Airy can rack up so much extra damage that she becomes unstoppable. Only 90 HP, just get Forest. You can shred through anyone in an instant, and squad wiping is no big deal. And there's no consequence for dying, except after additional 20 damage. That's the most OP kit for Bedwars ranked. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please subscribe as it's free and helps me a lot. And tell me you want to see more like this in the future. See you next time.